Suddenly, a towering white shadow burst from the undergrowth. An albino tiger, a creature of legends and wild power, appeared without warning. There was no fury in its gaze, but an ancestral perception of fragility and injustice. With a single, powerful headbutt, the feline knocked over the drum, which rolled heavily, carrying the elderly woman away from the edge of the abyss that awaited her. The drum, with its precious and terrified contents, slid down the slope, stopping only at the roadside. The tiger then stood over the drum, an unexpected guardian. Its roar, deep and primal, echoed across the landscape, an irrefutable command that made cars brake sharply, paralyzing traffic and revealing to the world the cruelty that was almost consummated, and the protection that the jungle itself offered. The tiger's roar was not just a sound, it was a primal force that ripped through the air, an irrefutable command that paralyzed the world. Tires shrieked on the hot asphalt, cars skidded, horns blared in a unison of panic and confusion. Traffic, once a continuous flow of hurried lives, now transformed into a metallic static mass, an improvised stage for the unfolding horror. Elena, still clutching the shovel, felt her blood run cold. Her meticulously planned scheme crumbled before her eyes, not due to human error, but to an intervention that defied all logic. A tiger. An albino tiger. The creature of legends, of nightmares, of children's tales was there, real, imposing, guarding the blue drum that contained her darkest secret. Initial panic gave way to a cold, desperate rage. How? How was this possible? The universe was conspiring against her, mocking her attempt to silence the past, to erase Maria's unbearable presence. From the top of the slope, she watched the scene as if it were a surreal film. The tiger, with its immaculate white fur, contrasted violently with the drum's garish blue and the asphalt's monotonous grey. Its posture was that of a king, a judge, an unexpected executioner. Drivers, initially shocked by the feline's presence, began to exit their vehicles, curiosity and fear mingling on their faces. They pointed, murmured, some already with cell phones in hand, recording the bizarre scene. But curiosity would soon transform into something far darker. Inside the drum, Maria, bound and gagged, felt the world spin. The impact of the tiger's headbutt, the dizzying descent, the final thud against the asphalt, it was all a symphony of terror and, strangely, of hope. She was alive, and not just alive, but exposed. The claustrophobic darkness of the drum was now a temporary refuge, but the sound of approaching voices, the murmur of the crowd, was the promise of salvation. She tried to scream, but the gag muffled the sound, turning it into a guttural moan that echoed against the plastic walls. The chemical smell was suffocating, but the air, even stale, was life. Elena instinctively stepped back, the shovel heavy in her hands like a confession. Her eyes scanned the road, searching for an escape route, a way to disappear before the truth was revealed. But it was too late. Traffic was halted in both directions. Dozens of eyes, previously focused on the tiger, began to descend to the drum, and then a braver, or perhaps more reckless driver cautiously approached, keeping a respectful distance from the tiger. He pointed to the drum, and his cry, laden with horror and disbelief, cut through the air. "There's someone in there!" Those words were like a starting gun. The crowd's murmur transformed into a chorus of astonishment. More people approached, their faces contorted in shock. The tiger, oblivious to the human commotion, maintained its guard, its golden eyes fixed on the crowd, a living barrier between the victim and the outside world, and between the victim and her tormentor. It did not move, did not roar again, merely observed, its majestic and menacing presence serving as a clear warning. Elena felt cold sweat trickle down her spine. Her heart pounded uncontrollably, a drum of panic in her chest. The image of Maria, bound and gagged, emerging from that drum, was a death sentence for her freedom, for her life. She could feel the crowd's stares, even if they didn't yet know who she was. Shame, guilt, the fear of being discovered, all mingled in a toxic cocktail. She needed to act, but what? Attack the tiger? That was suicide. Run? Where to? The road was blocked. The woods, her former refuge, now seemed like a dead-end labyrinth. A man, phone to his ear, gesticulated frantically. Yes, a tiger. And a drum. Looks like there's someone inside. Quick, please. The police, the ambulance, the media, everything would come. Time was running out. Elena felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, not from an earthquake, but from the imminence of her own ruin. The morning sun, once a silent accomplice, now seemed like a merciless spotlight, illuminating every detail of her crime. The savagery of nature had thwarted human savagery, and now the stage was set for the most shocking revelation that Road had ever witnessed. The elderly woman, inside the drum, was living proof of a cruelty that the jungle itself refused to permit. And Eleanor, the architect of it all, was trapped, watching her nightmare become reality. The distant wail of the siren, once a mere premonition, now solidified in the air, growing in volume and urgency. For Elena, each pulse of that metallic lament was a hammer striking her head, dismantling the last vestiges of her control. The plan, so perfect in its cold, calculated conception, crumbled in an avalanche of absurdity. A tiger, a damned albino tiger. Who could have foreseen such a savage intervention? She was trapped. The steep slope, once her vantage point, was now a cage without bars. Below, the road seethed. Cars, once mere points of passage, were now eyewitnesses, their occupants an impromptu jury. The crowd, which had previously murmured in curiosity, now stirred in a frenzy of horror and anticipation. The driver's shout, "There's someone in there!" had torn the veil of ignorance, and now the truth, or at least its imminence, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Eleanor's eyes scanned the scene, desperate. Where to go? The woods, so complicit in their darkness, now seemed an impenetrable tangle, full of unknown dangers. The road, blocked in both directions, was a dead-end corridor. She felt cold sweat trickle down her temples, mixing with the dust and grime of the asphalt. The shovel, still in her hands, was an unbearable weight, a symbol of her macabre intent, a silent confession. As the sirens approached, the crowd's murmur intensified. Some, more audacious, tried to approach the drum, human curiosity overcoming the fear of the predator. But the tiger, oh, the tiger, it remained there unshakable, a statue of white marble and tense muscles. Its golden eyes, previously fixed on the crowd, now seemed to pierce Elena's soul, even from a distance. It was as if nature itself, in its purest and most untamed form, had risen to prevent human barbarity. Inside the drum, Maria, the mother-in-law, felt hope rekindle in her chest, a fragile but persistent flame amidst the claustrophobic terror. The sound of sirens was music to her ears, the murmur of the crowd, the promise of salvation. She struggled, trying to make more noise, to emit any sound that could be heard beyond the plastic walls and the gag. The chemical smell was suffocating, but she breathed, she fought, she lived. The life that Elena had tried to extinguish with such coldness now clung to her with renewed strength. The first police cars burst onto the scene, their blue and red lights spinning in a frantic ballet, painting the grey asphalt with colours of urgency. Chaos escalated. Police officers, megaphones in hand, tried to control the crowd, which now gathered, cell phones raised, recording every detail of that surreal scene. An albino tiger, a blue drum, a person trapped inside. It was a horror movie script, but it was reality, raw and stark. The tension was palpable, almost electric. The police officers, trained to deal with the unexpected, were visibly perplexed. A large, wild animal guarding what appeared to be a crime scene. How to approach? How to rescue the victim without provoking the tiger? The situation was unprecedented. Elena watched everything, her heart beating erratically. Every movement of the police, every gaze from the crowd seemed directed at her. She was a shadow on the slope, but she felt exposed, as if an invisible spotlight illuminated her. Shame and panic mingled in a bitter cocktail. She couldn't stay. She couldn't be seen. The image of Maria emerging from that drum, pointing at her, was a vision that haunted her, a sentence of imprisonment, of ostracism, of ruin. She took a step back, then another, her eyes fixed on the woods. A desperate escape, yes, but the only option. Time was running out. The police were already approaching the drum, some with weapons drawn, cautiously, respecting the tiger's menacing majesty. The revelation was imminent. Elena felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, not from an earthquake, but from the imminence of her own destruction. She needed to disappear, to evaporate, before the world knew what she had done. The savagery of nature had thwarted human savagery, and now the stage was set for the most shocking revelation that Rhodes had ever witnessed. The elderly woman inside the drum was living proof of a cruelty that the jungle itself refused to permit. And Eleanor, the architect of it all, was trapped, watching her nightmare become reality. Her only chance was to become a shadow, a ghost, before the light of truth consumed her entirely. The forest, once a refuge, now seemed like a labyrinth, and Elena, the hunter, had become the hunted. Elena plunged into the woods, each leaf crackling under her feet a warning shot. The air, once fresh and humid, now felt dense and suffocating, laden with the smell of wet earth and her own cold sweat. Thin branches whipped her face and arms, leaving stinging scratches, but the physical pain was a mere whisper compared to the agony in her soul. She was a cornered beast, fleeing not from jungle predators, but from human justice, from herself. The tiger's roar, the crowd's clamor, the sirens, all mingled in an infernal cacophony that echoed in her mind, a chorus of condemnation. She did not look back. She could not. The image of Maria, her mother-in-law, trapped in that drum, was a distorted mirror of her own imminent fate. The thought of being dragged back, exposed, judged, was more terrifying than any monster the forest could hide. She stumbled, almost falling, but the force of panic propelled her. The tree roots, previously invisible, now became treacherous traps, and the damp, slippery ground threatened with every step. The dress she wore, once immaculate, was now torn and dirty, a symbol of her downfall. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Oxygen was scarce, her lungs burned, but she couldn't stop. Where was she going? There was no plan, only the visceral need to get away, to become a distant memory before reality caught up to her. She clung to a tree trunk, gasping, trying to catch her breath, but the sound of sirens seemed to intensify, piercing the dense foliage. They were getting closer, or perhaps it was just her mind, distorting reality, amplifying every sound. On the road, the macabre spectacle unfolded under the merciless sun. More police vehicles arrived, followed by an ambulance and, to everyone's surprise, a vehicle identified as animal control. The crowd, previously merely curious, was now in a frenzy of excitement and horror, recording everything with their cell phones, creating an impromptu media circus. The police, with their shields and weapons, maintained a respectful distance from the tiger, which remained a white and golden sphinx, its eyes fixed on the blue drum. The burly officer, the same one who had used the megaphone, now spoke to a colleague, pointing to the drum and the tiger. "We can't risk it. If he attacks, we'll have an even bigger problem. The priority is the victim, but how do we get to her?" Frustration was evident in his voice. The animal control specialists, 2 men and a woman in khaki uniforms, approached cautiously, one of them carrying a tranquilizer rifle. "Sirs, we need space," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "This animal is acting protectively. Any sudden movement could be interpreted as a threat." She observed the tiger through binoculars, her trained eyes analyzing every tense muscle, every subtle movement. It's an adult male, in excellent condition, and it seems aware of what it's doing. Inside the drum, Maria felt the world spin. The chemical smell was unbearable, but the fresh air seeping through the cracks was a blessing. She heard the voices, the footsteps, the tiger's roar, the sirens. Hope, once a thread, was now a rope pulling her out of that plastic hell. She tried to scream again, but the gag muffled the sound. Her wrists and ankles were numb, but she struggled, trying to move the drum, to make any noise that would indicate she was alive, that she was there. The life Elena wanted to bury refused to yield. The tiger, oblivious to the human commotion, took a slow step around the drum, like a sentinel on its rounds. Its golden eyes, previously fixed on the drum, now turned to the animal specialists, as if assessing their intentions. There was a wild dignity in its posture, an ancestral wisdom that seemed to defy human logic. It was not just an animal, it was a guardian, a herald of a truth about to be revealed. The specialists conferred, their voices low, almost inaudible. The man with the tranquilizer rifle raised it slightly, but the woman stopped him with a gesture. No, not yet. He's not aggressive, just protective. A dart could make him react unpredictably. And what if he falls on the drum? The logic was irrefutable. The situation was delicate, a dangerous ballet between wild and human life. Elena, hidden behind a dense bush, heard fragments of the conversation. Tranquilizer rifle, dart, fall on the drum. With each word, a shiver ran down her spine. They were getting closer. Not to her, not yet, but to the drum, to the evidence of her crime. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push away the image of Maria being rescued, of her accusing voice, of her pointing finger. The humiliation would be unbearable. Prison, a certainty. She stood up again, gasping for breath, and continued her desperate flight. The forest grew denser, darker, and the sunlight barely penetrated the tree canopy. She felt the dampness of the soil beneath her feet, the smell of decaying leaves, the oppressive silence that contrasted with the chaos of the road. But the silence was an illusion. Her mind was filled with noises. Her pounding heart, the whisper of her conscience, the echo of the sirens. She was not a woman of the forest. Her high heels and elegant dress were a cruel joke in that hostile environment. She was barefoot now, her shoes lost in some stumble. Her feet were sore, scratched, but she felt no pain. Adrenaline was a potent anesthetic and fear a constant whip. She needed to go deeper, to become part of the forest, invisible, unreachable. But the forest was not a refuge. It was a labyrinth, a green purgatory. Every tree seemed a silent judge, every shadow an accuser. She looked to the sky, searching for a sign, a direction, but the tree canopies formed an impenetrable roof. She was lost, not just physically, but morally, spiritually. The perfect plan had transformed into a nightmare, and the tiger, that majestic and unpredictable animal, had been the executioner of her ambitions. She heard a new sound, a distant hum that grew louder. A helicopter? No, it couldn't be. But the sound grew, unmistakable. A police helicopter, or perhaps a news helicopter approaching. The world was coming for her. The forest, however dense, would not be enough. She was cornered not by a wall, but by the inevitability of truth. The light of truth, which she so feared, was about to descend upon her, not as a spotlight, but as a lightning bolt, incinerating her existence. The distant hum transformed into a mechanical roar that ripped through the forest canopy, a metallic, merciless sound that did not belong in that green sanctuary. Elena looked up, her neck aching, and through a gap in the dense foliage she glimpsed it, a helicopter. It wasn't a distant speck in the sky, but a war machine hovering low, its blades whipping the air with a deafening fury. The sunlight reflected off its metal body, transforming it into a giant, omnipresent eye that seemed to scour every inch of the forest. Panic, once a whisper, was now a deafening scream in her mind. They found her. The world was coming for her, not just the police on the road, but the skies, the eyes of everyone. She threw herself to the ground, crawling desperately under a tangle of ferns and thorny bushes, trying to merge with the earth, to become invisible. Every leaf that stirred, every branch that snapped under her weight, seemed like a beacon pointing to her. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled her nostrils, but there was no comfort there, only the sensation of being a cornered prey with the predator flying above. The helicopter hovered for a moment, its vibrations shaking the ground and the trees around her, then began to move slowly towards the road, as if it had completed its initial sweep mission. Elena felt momentary relief, but knew it was illusory. This was just the beginning. The flying machine was a herald, announcing that the forest's privacy had been violated, that there was nowhere left to run. She closed her eyes, hot tears streaming down her dirty temples. The perfect plan, meticulously orchestrated, had crumbled into a chaos of claws, roars, and sirens. The tiger, that impossible animal, had been the instrument of her ruin, and now the helicopter was the messenger of her condemnation. On the road, the spectacle gained a new dimension. The helicopter, identified with the insignia of a local news station, hovered over the scene, its cameras already broadcasting live to millions of homes. The crowd went wild, waving at the aircraft, their cell phones raised like offerings to a new god of information. The arrival of the aerial press transformed the incident into a national event, a tragedy with elements of the bizarre and animal heroism. The police officers on the road, previously focused only on the drum and the tiger, now had to contend with the aerial chaos and media pressure. The burly officer, megaphone in hand, gesticulated frantically at the helicopter, asking it to move away. But it was useless. The news was too big to be contained. The animal control woman, binoculars still in hand, watched the tiger with increasing concern. The noise and wind from the blades were visibly agitating the animal. Its tense muscles contracted, and a low growl, almost inaudible beneath the helicopter's roar, escaped its throat. Its golden eyes, previously fixed on the drum and the humans, now turned to the flying threat, following every movement. "He's getting stressed," the woman said, her voice tense. "We need to act. The helicopter is making the situation worse." The man with the tranquilizer rifle nodded, but the dilemma remained. How to approach the tiger without provoking an attack, and how to accurately fire the dart with the wind and noise. And above all, how to ensure that the animal, when falling, would not crush the drum and what was inside it. Inside the drum, Maria felt the change in atmosphere. The chemical smell was still suffocating, but the air entering through the cracks now came with a deafening roar and an intense vibration that made the drum tremble. She couldn't see, but she could feel. It was as if the world was collapsing on her, but somehow that also meant the world was aware of her. Hope, once a fragile flame, was now a fire. The helicopter, the noise, the agitation, all of it meant rescue was closer than ever. She struggled with new energy, trying to scream, to move the drum, to do anything to let them know she was there, alive, trapped in that blue hell. The tiger, oblivious to human complexity, let out a powerful roar, no longer a warning, but a declaration of fury. Its claws extended, digging into the asphalt, and it crouched, ready to attack. The helicopter, in its search for dramatic angles, had approached too closely, and the tiger's protective instinct had reached its limit. It was not just protecting the drum, it was defending its territory, its strange and unexpected cargo, from a threat coming from the skies. The animal control specialists retreated, aware of the imminent danger. The man with the rifle raised it again, but the woman stopped him. "We can't risk a mistake now. If he attacks us, The media will have an even bigger spectacle, and the victim will be in danger. The situation was a deadly stalemate. The tiger, the drum, the elderly woman, the police, animal control, the crowd, and now the aerial press. Elena, hidden in the forest, watched the helicopter move away from the road and begin a new sweep, this time slower, more methodical, towards the woods. The sound of the blades approached again, louder, more menacing. She knew she had nowhere to go. The forest, her last refuge, had become a trap, and the sky, her executioner. The light of truth was not a spotlight, but the beacon of a helicopter sweeping the shadows, about to expose her shame to the entire world. She was cornered, and the hunt was about to end. The helicopter's mechanical roar was no longer a distant hum, but a storm of metal and wind tearing through the forest above Elena. The blades, like giant scythes, whipped the air, and the wind current forced the trees to bend, further exposing the forest floor. She was cowering, arms over her head, desperately trying to become smaller, invisible, part of the damp earth and decaying leaves. The smell of soil and moss mingled with the cold sweat of panic, and the metallic taste of fear filled her mouth. Her eyes, previously fixed on the sky through gaps in the foliage, were now tightly shut, as if she could erase the reality of that approaching beacon. The light, previously just a reflection, transformed into an intense white beam that pierced the treetops, dancing over the forest floor like a divine, merciless eye. It swept the woods, methodical, relentless, and with each sweep, Elena's heart pounded harder, a drum of despair in her chest. She felt the warmth of the light on her skin, which meant it was close, very close. There was nowhere to go. The forest, which had seemed an endless labyrinth, was now a cage, its green walls closing around her. She was not a woman of the forest. She lacked the cunning or strength to resist this aerial hunt. She was just a woman, barefoot, dirty, with a torn dress, her perfect plan in tatters. In the helicopter, the news crew worked frantically. The pilot, a veteran with years of experience in pursuits and rescues, kept the aircraft stable despite the wind and the density of the forest. The camera operator, with the zoom at maximum, scanned the landscape below. "Movement there!" shouted the cameraman, his voice muffled by the headset. "Near that cluster of ferns. It looks like a person." The pilot adjusted position, and the light beam fixed. The image, shaky for an instant, stabilized. A woman, cowering, dirty, her face, even from a distance, seemed familiar to the reporter narrating live. "My dear viewers, it appears our team has just located a human figure in the forest. Could it be the person responsible for this terrible incident? Authorities have not yet confirmed, but the image is shocking." On the road, the crowd and police watched the helicopter stop, its light beam fixed on a spot in the woods. A buzz of excitement and horror swept through the mass of curious onlookers. Cell phones were pointed at the forest, trying to capture what the aerial cameras were already transmitting. The burly officer, megaphone in hand, tried to calm the situation, but it was useless. The story was unfolding before everyone's eyes, live, unfiltered. The animal control woman, binoculars still glued to her eyes, watched the tiger. The helicopter's noise, now hovering over the forest, had pushed the animal to its limit. Its growls were more frequent, deeper. It not only crouched, but made small leaps, its claws scratching the asphalt with contained fury. Its golden eyes, previously focused on the drum, now divided between the aerial threat and the approaching humans. "He's going to attack," she whispered, her voice tense. "He's at his limit. We can't wait any longer." The man with the tranquilizer rifle nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. He knew every second counted. Maria's safety, still trapped in the drum, depended on his precision. But how to shoot an animal so agitated, with the helicopter's rotor wash and the pressure of millions of eyes? He raised the rifle, aiming for the tiger's shoulder, the only spot that offered a chance of success without hitting the drum. Inside the drum, Maria felt the change. The helicopter's noise, once a distant roar, now seemed to be directly above her, making the drum's metal vibrate with terrifying intensity. She felt the tiger's movement, the growls, the tension in the air. Hope, once a fire, was now a flickering flame, threatened by a wind too strong. She struggled with all her might, pounding her fists against the drum's inner walls, trying to make a sound, any sound, so they would know she was there, alive, and that time was running out. The tiger, in a fit of rage, let out a deafening roar that echoed across the road and through the forest. It was no longer just protecting, it was defending its territory, its strange cargo, from all threats. With a swift, powerful movement, it lunged forward, not at the specialists, but at the air, a symbolic attack against the helicopter that tormented it. Its claws extended, and it scratched the asphalt with brutal force, leaving deep marks. It was at that instant that the helicopter's light, in the middle of the forest, intensified. It was no longer a beam, but a spotlight that swept the darkness, and then it stopped. It stopped directly over Elena. She looked up, blinded by the light, and saw the silhouette of the aircraft hovering above like a giant predator. The blades whipped the air, and she felt the strong wind on her face. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. She was exposed. The helicopter's cameras focused on her, and the image of Elena, dirty, barefoot, with her dress torn and her face marked by despair, was broadcast to the entire world. Her eyes, wide with horror and resignation, met the camera lens, and in that moment, she knew the hunt was over. The truth, which she had tried so hard to bury, had emerged, not from the ground, but from the heavens, and the helicopter's light was her judge, her executioner, exposing her shame to millions of eyes. She was cornered not by walls, but by the inevitability of her own ruin. The helicopter's light was not just a beam, it was a hammer of light, striking Elena's head, crushing any last shred of hope. She could no longer hide. The wind from the blades, once a distant breath, was now a violent storm lashing her body, tearing her already ragged dress. Leaves and dirt flew around her, and she smelled her own defeat mingled with the damp scent of the forest. She looked up, blinded, and saw the silhouette of the aircraft, a metal monster hovering above, its lights like hungry eyes. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The hunt was over, and the predator from the skies had found its prey. In the helicopter, the reporter's voice echoed, amplified for millions of homes. Confirmed, it's a woman. Authorities are now moving to the location. It seems the search for the person responsible for this heinous act has come to an end. The camera focused on her, mercilessly capturing every detail of her despair. Tangled hair, a face streaked with dirt and tears, wide eyes reflecting the brutal light. She was a cornered animal, and the entire world was watching her capture. The sound of sirens, previously muffled by distance, now rapidly approached, cutting through the forest air, announcing the arrival of justice. On the road, the man with the tranquilizer rifle could wait no longer. The tiger, a whirlwind of muscle and fury, was about to explode. Its growls were continuous, a guttural warning that made the ground vibrate. Its golden eyes, previously focused on the drum, now divided between the aerial threat and the approaching humans, its muscles tense, ready to spring. The animal control woman nodded, an expression of urgency on her face. "Now!" she shouted, her voice almost inaudible beneath the animal's roar and the helicopter's noise. The man took a deep breath, sweat trickling down his forehead. The pressure was immense. Millions of eyes, the life of an elderly woman, the safety of everyone there. He aimed not at the center of the body, where the dart might be less effective or more dangerous, but at the shoulder, a spot that offered a chance of success without hitting the drum. His fingers squeezed the trigger. A sibilant whistle cut through the air, almost imperceptible amidst the chaos. The dart flew. The tiger, at the height of its fury, was about to lunge, but before it could move a muscle, it felt a sharp sting in its shoulder. A shock. It wasn't the pain of a bullet, but a strange, paralyzing sensation that rapidly spread through its veins. It let out a roar of surprise and confusion, louder and more piercing than any before. Its body, once a mass of tension and power, began to yield. Its legs wavered, and its golden eyes, previously full of fury, now showed a glint of perplexity and drowsiness. Inside the drum, Maria felt the impact. It wasn't a direct impact on the metal, but a strong vibration that coursed through her entire body, followed by a roar that seemed to come from within the drum itself. The sound was different, laden with a pain and surprise she had never heard before. Then, silence, a strange, heavy silence that followed the roar. The helicopter's noise was still there, but the tiger's constant growling had ceased. She felt the drum sway once, twice, as if something heavy had fallen beside it. Hope, once a flickering flame, was now a wildfire, fueled by uncertainty and the premonition that something monumental had just occurred. The tiger, in a last effort to remain standing, staggered. Its eyes slowly closed, and its massive body gave way, collapsing with a dull thud onto the asphalt, mere inches from the blue drum. Dust rose, and a collective gasp of relief and shock swept through the crowd. The animal, once an unstoppable force of nature, lay inert, its breathing heavy and deep. The animal control specialists rushed to the tiger, checking its vital signs, ensuring the dart had done its job. The woman, binoculars still in hand, watched the sleeping animal, a mixture of relief and sadness on her face. "He's fine," she said, her voice choked. "Just sleeping. But what about the drum?" Everyone's attention turned to the blue drum. It was intact, but the tiger's proximity, the chemical smell, the uncertainty of what lay inside. The burly officer, megaphone in hand, now pointed to the drum. "Rescue team, approach with caution. We have a trapped victim." In the middle of the forest, the sound of sirens became deafening. Two police officers, with bulletproof vests and weapons drawn, descended from the helicopter, their heavy boots crushing dry leaves and branches. Elena was there, cowering, arms over her head, as if she could shield herself from the inevitable. The spotlight fixed on her, and the helicopter's cameras broadcast every second. She raised her face, her tear-filled eyes meeting those of the police officers. There was no fight left in her, only a profound resignation. "Elena Santos, you're under arrest," shouted one of the police officers, his voice firm and authoritative, "for kidnapping, attempted murder, and concealment of a body." She did not respond. Only a sob escaped her lips, and she collapsed, kneeling on the damp earth. Cold handcuffs were placed on her wrists, and the metallic sound sealed her fate. The hunt was over, not with a roar, but with the click of metal, and the truth, which she had tried so hard to bury, was now exposed to the entire world, under the merciless light of the helicopter. On the road, the rescue team, wearing masks and gloves, approached the blue drum. The chemical smell was strong, but the priority was human life. With special tools, they began to work, trying to open the sealed lid. The crowd, in tense silence, watched every movement. The entire world waited, holding its breath, to discover what or who was inside that blue hell. Maria's hope now depended on the agility and precision of those men. Time was running out. Time was running out. And the rescue team knew it. In protective suits and gas masks, they approached the blue drum, the chemical smell now not just an annoyance, but a palpable threat, a constant reminder of the danger Maria faced. One of the men, an experienced firefighter with years of rescues under his belt, assessed the situation. The lid was hermetically sealed, designed to contain dangerous substances. It wouldn't be easy. He signaled to his team, and tools were laid out on the asphalt. Electric saws, crowbars, cutting torches. The crowd, kept at a safe distance by a police cordon, watched in sepulchral silence, every breath held, every movement of the rescuers amplified by the tension. The cameras from helicopters and ground press missed not a single detail, broadcasting the agony of waiting to millions of homes, to a world holding its breath. Inside the drum, Maria felt the metal vibrate. The tiger's silence was a relief, but the new noise, a metallic scratching sound followed by a sharp hum, was equally terrifying. She didn't know what was happening, but the intensity of the sounds and the constant vibration made her believe the end was near. The thin air, the overwhelming claustrophobia, and the uncertainty corroded her sanity. She coughed, feeling her throat scratch, and the chemical smell, though not as strong as imagined, was enough to cause nausea and dizziness. Her fists, once full of strength, now barely managed to lift. Hope, which had rekindled for a brief moment, now fought against darkness and exhaustion. "I'm here!" she tried to scream, but her voice was a hoarse whisper, inaudible even to herself, a plea lost in the metallic abyss. The firefighter, electric saw in hand, began to cut the top of the drum. Sparks flew through the air, illuminating the night's darkness and the sweaty faces of the rescuers. The sound of the saw was deafening, a metallic lament echoing through the forest, a war cry against time. But the drum's metal was more resistant than expected. Designed to withstand pressure and impact, it yielded slowly, each inch a battle. Time stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. The animal control woman, now beside the burly officer, watched with her heart in her throat. The sleeping tiger was a silent reminder of the miracle that had occurred, and of the tragedy that could still unfold. Meanwhile, in the forest, Elena was dragged away by the police. The handcuffs on her wrists gleamed under the spotlight, a cruel symbol of her defeat, a cold glint that sealed her fate. She offered no resistance, her eyes fixed on the ground, tears streaming down her dirty face, mixing with the earth and despair. The helicopter reporter continued his relentless narration, describing the scene to the world. The suspect is being taken into custody, a shocking conclusion to such a brutal crime. But the question remains, who is inside the drum? And more importantly, is she alive? The reporter's voice was a hammer, beating against Elena's head. Each word a reminder of her failure and the public exposure of her wickedness. A shame that would be broadcast forever. Back on the road, the firefighter swapped the saw for a cutting torch. Blue fire danced at the tool's tip, and the smell of burnt metal mingled with the chemical odor, creating a suffocating atmosphere of urgency. The rescue team knew they couldn't delay. With each passing second, the oxygen inside the drum diminished, and the internal temperature could dangerously rise. The tension was palpable, an invisible weight hanging over everyone, crushing hope and fueling fear. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, a section of the lid began to yield. A small circle of metal was removed, revealing a damp darkness and the strong smell of the chemical, a premonition of what was to come. The firefighter leaned in, using a powerful flashlight to illuminate the interior. A collective gasp escaped the crowd as the image was broadcast to screens worldwide. There she was, huddled, eyes closed, skin pale, and lips cracked. Maria, alive, but barely. "She's alive!" shouted the firefighter, his voice hoarse with emotion, a cry of relief that echoed among the rescuers. The team acted quickly. With extreme care, they used hydraulic cutting tools to widen the opening, transforming the drum into a metallic cocoon. Every movement was calculated, every cut precise, to avoid injuring the elderly woman. The process was agonizingly slow, but the sight of Maria, however weak, was an adrenaline shot for everyone, a reason to continue. When the opening was large enough, two rescuers in protective suits sprang into action. Delicately, they pulled her out, her frail, inert body. Maria was unconscious, but breathing. Her eyes opened for a brief moment, confused, before closing again, exhausted. She was covered in a thin layer of a bluish, sticky liquid which exuded a strong but non-corrosive odor. It was a type of industrial resin, toxic if ingested, but which, fortunately, had not caused severe burns to her skin. A medical team, already prepared, received her on a stretcher. Quickly, they removed her soaked clothes, covering her with thermal blankets and connecting her to monitoring equipment. The ambulance sirens, once a distant sound, now became a chorus of hope, announcing the arrival of salvation. Maria was safe, but her recovery journey would be long. The burly officer, megaphone in hand, announced to the crowd, "The victim has been rescued. She is alive and receiving medical attention." A roar of relief and applause erupted from the crowd, a cathartic sound that echoed across the road and through the forest. Cameras focused on Maria being taken to the ambulance, and then on the blue drum, now open, a silent testament to cruelty and resilience. The albino tiger, still asleep, lay a few meters away, its immaculate white fur under the spotlights. It was the unlikely hero, the silent guardian who, with an act of instinctive fury, had diverted the course of a tragedy. The animal control woman approached it, gently stroking its head. "Good boy," she whispered, a tear tracing her face, a silent tribute to the animal that had saved a life. Good boy. The story of Maria and the albino tiger would spread worldwide, a modern fable of wickedness and salvation, of despair and hope. But for Maria, the fight was just beginning. For Eleanor, justice awaited. And for the tiger, the future was uncertain, but its legend that was sealed, the blue drum, now empty and violated, was the material proof of a nightmare that had ended, but whose scars would last forever. The wail of ambulance sirens tore through the night, carrying Maria away from the metallic nightmare. Inside, the medical team worked with silent urgency, every movement calculated to stabilize the elderly woman. The bluish liquid, a high-viscosity industrial resin, covered her body like a second skin, exuding a chemical odor that permeated the air. There were no severe burns, a miracle attributed to the substance's non-corrosive composition, but prolonged inhalation and severe dehydration were immediate concerns. Maria was unconscious, her breathing weak and irregular, her pulse almost imperceptible. With each passing second, the doctors fought against time, against the invisible damage that confinement and toxicity had inflicted on her fragile body. Meanwhile, a few meters away, Eleanor was pushed into a police van. The handcuffs on her wrists seemed to tighten not just her flesh, but her soul, sealing a fate that she, in her blind fury, had never imagined. The spotlight still followed her, transforming her pale, tear-stained face into a public spectacle of shame and defeat. The silence inside the vehicle was broken only by Elena's choked sobs and the rustling of leaves beneath the tires, a sound that seemed to mock her attempt to bury the truth in the darkness of the forest. She did not defend herself, did not protest. She simply cowered, her gaze lost, as if the weight of her actions had finally crushed her, obliterating any trace of resistance. The hunt was over, but the judgment, both legal and moral, was just beginning. On the road, the blue drum, now open and violated, lay like a scar on the landscape, a macabre monument to almost unimaginable cruelty. Forensic teams were already approaching, their white suits contrasting with the night's darkness, ready to unravel the secrets the metal had held. The chemical smell still lingered in the air, a pungent reminder of the hell Maria had endured. The crowd, which had previously applauded in relief, now watched in thoughtful silence, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. The helicopter cameras continued to broadcast, no longer the agony of waiting, but the cold reality of the consequences. The albino tiger, the unlikely hero, still slept deeply, oblivious to the chaos it had unleashed and the life it had saved. The animal control woman, with a team of veterinarians, prepared for the majestic feline's transport. The decision about its future was complex. It was a wild animal, a predator, but also a savior. Wildlife sanctuaries were already reaching out, offering a safe home, away from human curiosity and the dangers of urban life. The burly officer, megaphone in hand, observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and perplexity. That tiger, which should have been a threat, had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that nature, in its unpredictability, can be both cruel and miraculous. At the hospital, Maria was taken directly to the emergency room. Doctors worked frantically to remove the resin from her body, a delicate and time-consuming process. Every fiber of her being seemed to protest, but the team, trained to handle extreme trauma, acted with precision. Preliminary exams revealed severe dehydration, hypothermia, and signs of shock. Her lungs, though not directly affected by the resin, showed irritation due to the inhalation of chemical fumes. The battle for her life was far from over. Physical recovery would be long and painful, but the recovery of her soul from the psychological trauma of being imprisoned and abandoned to her fate would be even more challenging. Meanwhile, at the police station, Elena was undergoing her first interrogation. Sitting in a cold, impersonal room, under the relentless glare of a fluorescent lamp, she refused to cooperate. Her eyes, once tear-filled, now displayed a disturbing coldness, an emptiness that unnerved the police officers. "Why, Elena?" the detective asked, his voice calm and persistent. "Why did you do this to your mother-in-law, Maria?" The word mother-in-law seemed to hit Elena like an electric shock. A tremor ran through her body, and a bitter, almost imperceptible smile distorted her lips. She did not answer, but her silence was eloquent, laden with years of resentment and bitterness. The story behind that brutal act was deep, complex, and was only just beginning to unravel. The world, through its screens, watched every development. The story of Maria, the elderly woman rescued from the drum, and the albino tiger, her improbable savior, became a modern legend, a dark fairy tale with a touch of wild heroism. The media speculated about Elena's motives, about the troubled relationship between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, about the fragility of the human mind and the capacity to commit such heinous acts. The blue drum, now an object of evidence, was the center of attention, a metaphor for the darkness that can reside in human hearts. For Maria, the fight for life continued, a fragile breath of hope amidst the darkness. For Elena, the future was a cold cell and public condemnation, and for the tiger, the white-furred hero, its fate was uncertain. But its image, that of a wild guardian, was forever etched in collective memory. Scars, both visible and invisible, began to form, marking not only those involved, but society itself, with the memory of a nightmare that by a narrow margin did not become an irreparable tragedy. Silence emanated from Elena, denser than the heavy air of the interrogation room. It was not the silence of fear, but of a glacial, almost defiant determination. The detective, a man with a tired face and keen eyes, knew he was facing a wall. The fluorescent light hummed, revealing every pore on her pale skin, every smudge of blue resin that still clung stubbornly to her fingernails. "Elena," he repeated, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel, "your mother-in-law is fighting for her life in the hospital. Do you understand the gravity of what you did?" No response, only the empty gaze, fixed on an invisible spot on the wall. The detective tried another tactic. Your husband, Maria's son, is in shock. He can't believe what happened. The mention of her husband, however, did not produce the expected reaction. There was no guilt, no visible remorse, only a slight tremor on her lips, an almost smile that dissolved before fully forming, like a fleeting shadow of a perverse thought. What was going on in Elena's mind was a dark labyrinth, its doors seemingly sealed by an ancestral hatred. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Maria fought her own battle. Her fragile body, once inert, was now a silent battlefield. Monitors beeped at a constant rhythm, each sound a note in the symphony of the fight for life. The industrial resin had been removed, but the chemical smell still permeated her skin, a persistent reminder of hell. Severe dehydration and hypothermia were combated with intravenous fluids and thermal blankets, but the true enemy was shock, the brutal aggression that confinement and terror had inflicted upon her soul. Doctors spoke in low voices, technical terms like metabolic acidosis and post-traumatic stress syndrome hanging in the air. Physical recovery would be a marathon, but the recovery of her mind from the trauma of having been buried alive was an unknown. For a brief moment her eyes opened, not with clarity, but with a primal terror. A silent scream, a soundless nightmare escaped her cracked lips before sedation pulled her back into the protective darkness of unconsciousness. Far from the hospital bustle and the police station's chill, the albino tiger, the unlikely hero, was the center of a delicate operation. The animal control woman, with the help of specialized veterinarians, prepared it for transport. It was still under the effect of the tranquilizer, its immaculate white fur contrasting with the improvised stretcher. The decision about its future had been made, a renowned international wildlife sanctuary where it could live in a natural environment, away from human curiosity and the dangers of a city. The irony was palpable. A wild predator, whose nature was to hunt and kill, had become a symbol of salvation, an unexpected guardian against human cruelty. The story of Maria and the albino tiger had already spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with the hashtag #JustSaviorTiger. International media dedicated hours of coverage, transforming the event into a global spectacle. The blue drum, now an object of evidence meticulously examined by experts, was the centerpiece of a narrative that shocked and fascinated. Every scratch, every trace of resin, every fiber of cement Elena intended to use was catalogued, photographed, analyzed. It was material proof of murderous intent, a silent testimony to the darkness that can inhabit the human heart. Elena's husband and Maria's son, a man named Ricardo, finally arrived at the hospital. His face was pale, his eyes swollen with tears and disbelief. He couldn't process the image of his mother, frail and hooked up to machines, nor the idea of his wife, the woman he loved, capable of such an atrocity. He was led to a waiting room where a psychologist tried to calm him. "I don't understand," he murmured, his voice choked. "How could she do this? Why?" The pain in his voice was a lament, the personification of confusion and betrayal. At the police station, the detective continued his search for answers. He knew Eleanor's story was not simple. Years of resentment, bitterness, and perhaps even envy could have festered, transforming a seemingly normal woman into a potential murderer. The fleeting smile he had seen on Elena's lips, the coldness in her eyes, suggested a mind that had crossed a line, a point of no return. The hunt was over, but the real battle, that of unraveling the mind behind the crime, was just beginning. The world waited, holding its breath, to understand the depth of the darkness the blue drum had revealed. Scars, both visible and invisible, began to form, marking not only those involved, but society itself, with the memory of a nightmare that by a narrow margin did not become an irreparable tragedy. She looked up, and for the first time, there was something beyond coldness, a flickering flame of resentment, of years of contained bitterness ignited in her eyes. "He always defended her," she began, her voice still hoarse but gaining strength. "Like a stream turning into a torrent, always put her above me, above us. She was the saint, the victim, and me, I was the witch, the intruder." The words poured out, not as a confession of guilt, but as a torrent of old accusations, of wounds that never healed. The detective saw there the crack in the wall, the first fissure. The story he sought was beginning to unfold. A narrative of years of conflict, of a silent battle waged within the walls of a home that should have been a refuge. At the hospital, Maria, still under sedation, seemed to feel the echo of those distant words. Her body struggled, but her mind, even in its hazy state, seemed to relive the ghosts of the past. A moan escaped her lips, and a solitary tear trickled from the corner of her eye, wetting the pillow. It wasn't just the physical pain of the resin or the shock of confinement. It was the pain of a lifetime of misunderstandings, of a relationship with her daughter-in-law that had turned into a minefield. The doctors, oblivious to the emotional complexity, focused on vital signs, on stabilizing the body. But the nurse, with years of experience, noticed the subtle change in Maria's expression, the contraction of her facial muscles, as if she were reliving a nightmare that went far beyond the drum. Ricardo, in the waiting room, was the image of desolation. Hearing the detective's words about Elena's statement, he felt a knot in his throat. He never understood anything. He always defended her. She was the saint, the victim. And I was the witch, the intruder. The words were a blow, a painful revelation. He tried to defend himself, but memories surfaced, the veiled arguments, the cutting glances, Elena's complaints about Maria's interference, his mother's defenses of her daughter-in-law's ingratitude. He had always tried to be the peacemaker, the mediator, but now he realized that his neutrality had been interpreted as partiality, his attempt to appease as abandonment. The pain of betrayal mingled with guilt. He had been blind, or worse, complacent, the psychologist observed, knowing that this was the beginning of a long and painful process of self-assessment for Ricardo, a man who now needed to reconstruct his perception of love and family. Outside, the world continued to revolve around the story, but with a new focus. The Tartusavia tiger dominated headlines, the image of the majestic white feline a beacon of hope amidst human darkness. The wildlife sanctuary, in a press conference, announced that the feline would be named Esperanza, a name that resonated with Maria's salvation and nature's improbable intervention. The tiger's image, serene and majestic, contrasted brutally with Elena's image, now exposed to public scrutiny, her pale, cold face plastered across all news reports. The blue drum, meticulously analyzed, revealed the details of premeditation. Forensic experts found traces of quick-drying cement, indicating a clear intention to seal Maria's fate in a matter of minutes. The cruelty of the act was undeniable, and society, shocked, sought to understand how such malice could flourish in a family environment. Criminal psychology experts debated on TV shows, trying to unravel the mind behind the crime, publicly dissecting Elena's life. Every detail of her past, every disagreement with Maria, every frustration transformed into a piece of a macabre puzzle. At the police station, Elena continued to speak, the torrent of resentment flowing, revealing a picture of years of perceived manipulation, of silent humiliations, of a battle for control that culminated in a desperate and brutal act. Elena's initial coldness gave way to a contained rage, a distorted justification of her actions. She saw herself not as a villain, but as a victim, pushed to the limit by a domineering mother-in-law and a blind husband. The tension in the room was palpable. With each of Elena's words, a new thread was pulled, revealing the complex web of hatred that had formed. The detective knew he was not just unraveling a crime, but the collapse of a family, the slow corrosion of a soul. The hunt was over, but the real battle, that of unraveling the mind behind the crime, was just beginning. The world waited, holding its breath, not only to understand the depth of the darkness the blue drum had revealed, but to comprehend how resentment can transform into such a lethal poison. Scars, both visible and invisible, began to form, marking not only those involved, but society itself, with the memory of a nightmare that, by a narrow margin, did not become an irreparable tragedy, and which now exposed the hidden wounds of a life. The silence in the interrogation room was an abyss, but Eleanor filled it with the torrent of her bitterness. Her words, once whispers, now gushed with a contained force, a fury that had festered for years. "He never listened to me," she continued, her voice raspy, yet with a disturbing clarity. "Never saw what she did. The small digs, the disapproving glances, the veiled comparisons. Your mother did it this way. In my day, women took care of the house differently. It was a slow poison, detective. A drop each day, corroding everything." The detective, with his experience in distorted minds, watched the justification solidify. Elena was not confessing a crime, but venting a lifetime of resentment, painting herself as the victim of a silent war. "She suffocated me," Elena continued, a feverish glint in her eyes. "Every decision, every choice had to pass her scrutiny. If I bought furniture, it wasn't good enough. If I cooked, it wasn't as tasty as hers. If I raised my son, she was there to correct. And I became a shadow in my own home, in my own life." The image she painted was that of a cornered woman, her identity stolen by an omnipresent mother-in-law. The detective knew that the truth was always more complex, but Eleanor's perception was her reality, and that reality had driven her to the brink of sanity. "And Ricardo?" he asked, his voice calm, almost hypnotic. "Didn't he see it?" Elena laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Ricardo? He was blind, or preferred to be. To him, his mother was untouchable. Any complaint of mine was exaggeration, drama. He always defended her, always protected her. I was the intruder, the foreigner who dared to disturb the peace of his small matriarchal kingdom." The coldness in her voice was a cloak, covering the pain and rage that propelled her. She did not regret what she had tried to do. She felt she had been forced into it, pushed to the brink by years of psychological torment. Far away at the hospital, Maria, still in an induced sleep, seemed to feel the echo of those words. Her body, previously tense, relaxed slightly, but a new, heavier tear trickled down her pale face. It wasn't just the physical pain that haunted her, but the pain of a lifetime of misunderstandings, of a relationship that she, in her own way, might also have tried to control, without realizing the abyss she was creating. The monitors beeped softly. Maria's life hanging by threads, but the invisible battle in her mind was as real as the marks on her body. Ricardo, in the waiting room, was a man in pieces. Elena's words, relayed by the detective, were a relentless hammer, shattering his perception of himself and his family. He never understood anything. He always defended her. "I was the witch." Each sentence was a blow, revealing a truth he had refused to see. The veiled arguments, the unspoken tensions, Elena's glances that he interpreted as jealousy, now revealed themselves as muffled cries for help. He remembered countless dinners where Maria corrected Elena's way of holding cutlery or commented on dust in a corner of the room. He remembered Elena cowering, her forced smile, and how he always tried to change the subject, to appease without ever confronting the root of the problem. His neutrality was not peace, it was cowardice. His mediation was blindness. Guilt crushed him, an unbearable weight. He had failed his wife, and now his mother almost paid the ultimate price. The psychologist beside him merely observed, knowing that Ricardo's pain was the beginning of a long and tortuous path of self-awareness and regret. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to revolve around the story, but with a new intensity. The giant savior tiger narrative solidified. The white feline, now named Esperanza, was safely transported to the sanctuary, its majestic and serene image contrasting with the darkness revealed in the blue drum. International media, previously focused on the heroic act, now delved into the depths of human psychology. TV shows debated mother-in-law syndrome, veiled psychological violence, and how resentment can corrode a soul to the breaking point. The blue drum, now a piece of forensic museum exhibit, was dissected in every detail. Experts revealed that the quick-drying cement was not just an intention, but an almost perfect execution. The exact quantity, the precise mixture, all indicated meticulous planning, not an impulsive act. This added an even darker layer to Elena's confession, transforming her rage into a cold, deliberate calculation. At the police station, Elena continued to weave her narrative of victimization. "She wouldn't let me breathe," she said, her voice now almost a lament but with a hint of triumph. "I tried everything. I talked to Ricardo, tried to talk to her, but she always turned the situation around, made me seem crazy, ungrateful." The detective took notes, each word a brick in building the case, but also in understanding a tragedy that went far beyond the crime itself. The tension in the room was almost palpable, the air heavy with the story of a lifetime of grievances. Elena, in her distorted mind, was not the villain, but the heroine of her own revenge, a woman who had finally broken free from the shackles of perceived oppression. The detective knew he was not just unraveling a crime, but the collapse of a family, the slow corrosion of a soul, and the terrible truth of how resentment can transform into such a lethal poison, capable of destroying not only a life, but the very structure of human compassion. Scars, visible and invisible, began to form, marking not only those involved, but society itself, with the memory of a nightmare that, by a narrow margin, did not become an irreparable tragedy, and which now exposed the hidden wounds of a life, the shadows lurking behind the closed doors of any home. The world waited, holding its breath, to understand the depth of the darkness the blue drum had revealed, and the terrible price of misunderstanding and silence. Suddenly, Eleanor stopped speaking. Her eyes, once feverish, now fixed on an empty spot on the wall, as if she were reliving each moment, not with remorse, but with a strange satisfaction. "I just wanted her to feel what I felt," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, but laden with a chilling intensity. The tightness, the lack of air, the weight of being invisible, of being erased. The detective felt a chill. There was no regret in her words, only the cold logic of a revenge that, to her, was just. The meticulous planning of the cement, the choice of the drum, everything fit into her narrative of retribution. She didn't just want to get rid of Maria. She wanted Maria to experience the same emotional suffocation she claimed to have suffered for years. The cruelty was not an accident, but an intention. At the hospital, Maria had a slight spasm. The monitors registered no major changes, but the nurse noticed a faint tremor on her lips. Perhaps, in her deep sleep, a fragment of the truth was finally reaching her, not as an attack, but as a distant echo of a pain that she, in her own blindness, had helped to cultivate. The thin line between victim and perpetrator became increasingly indistinct. Ricardo, beside the psychologist, received a message from the detective. "She says she wanted your mother to feel what she felt." The phrase pierced Ricardo like a dagger. He closed his eyes, and images of Elena cowering, of her forced smile, of her attempts to be heard, flooded his mind. He saw himself, the neutral son, the peacemaker husband, who was in fact a silent accomplice to the oppression. The cowardice the psychologist had mentioned now had a face, his own. His mother's pain in the hospital, his wife's calculated coldness at the police station, all were a reflection of his own failure to see, to act, to protect. The path to self-awareness would be long and painful, paved with the debris of his family and the guilt of his own inaction. The blue drum for Ricardo was not just an object of a crime, but a mirror, reflecting the darkness he had allowed to grow in his own home. Society, eager for answers, would continue to debate, to judge, to speculate. But for Ricardo, the true sentence had already been passed, not by a court, but by the relentless voice of his own conscience. The interrogation room, once a stage for Elena's torrent of bitterness, now became a sanctuary for her unshakable conviction. The detective, exhausted, watched her. There were no tears, no pleas, only the cold certainty of someone who, in her own mind, had achieved a distorted form of justice. "I don't regret it," she declared, her voice low but firm, echoing off the walls. "I just wanted her to know what it was like to be silenced, to be erased, to feel the weight of the cement, not on her body, but on her soul, as I felt for years." It was the final confession, not of guilt, but of a dark and deliberate purpose. The cruelty was not an accident, but the essence of her message. Far away in the aseptic silence of the hospital, Maria finally opened her eyes. The white ceiling light was blinding, and the smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils. There was no immediate pain, only a hazy confusion. The nurse, attentive, noticed the movement and called the doctor. Slowly and painfully, memories began to return. The tightness in the drum, the smell of cement, the roar. But more than that, Elena's words, those she had uttered at the police station and which, somehow, had pierced the veil of her induced sleep, now resonated in her mind. The tightness, the lack of air, the weight of being invisible, of being erased. Maria, the once imposing matriarch, now lay fragile, not only from physical injuries, but from the weight of a brutal revelation. She had been the tormentor in her own blindness and the victim of a revenge she herself had, unwittingly, cultivated. The thin line between victim and perpetrator became increasingly indistinct. She looked at the ceiling, and a solitary tear trickled down, not from physical pain, but from a late and profound regret. A painful understanding that her own rigidity had paved the way to the abyss. Ricardo, notified of his mother's awakening, rushed to the hospital. The psychologist accompanied him, a silent guide on his journey of self-discovery. Seeing Maria, so small and vulnerable in the bed, Ricardo felt a mixture of relief and an even more crushing guilt. He had failed both women in his life. His mother, for not having perceived the slow poison she distilled. His wife, for not having heard her muffled cries. He sat by the bed, holding Maria's wrinkled hand, and for the first time in years, there were no words of appeasement, only a heavy silence, laden with unspoken truths and an uncertain future. Maria's path to recovery would be long, both physically and emotionally, and Ricardo's path, to forgive himself and rebuild, would be even more tortuous. He knew he would need to confront not only Eleanor, but himself, and the image of the blue drum would forever be a mirror of his own inaction. Eleanor's trial captured the nation's attention. The defense argued temporary insanity, years of psychological abuse, mother-in-law syndrome, taken to the extreme. The prosecution, on the other hand, presented the meticulous planning, the cold and deliberate intent, the lack of remorse. Elena remained impassive, her narrative of victimization unaltered. Society was divided. Some saw her as a broken woman, pushed to the limit. Others as a calculating criminal. The verdict, when it finally arrived, was guilty, but with a recommendation for intensive psychological counseling. The sentence would be severe, but the true condemnation had already been pronounced by the relentless voice of her own conscience and the irreversible fragmentation of her family. As Elena was led away to serve her sentence, the image of the albino tiger, Esperanza, continued to circulate. The feline, now adapted to the sanctuary, was a living reminder that even in the deepest darkness, life finds a way to intervene, to offer a second chance, to roar against injustice and silence. Esperanza became a symbol of divine intervention, of a miracle that prevented an even greater tragedy. The blue drum, now a piece of forensic evidence, would be studied, dissected, but never fully understood in its entirety. It represented not just a crime, but the collapse of a family, the slow corrosion of a soul, and the terrible truth of how resentment can transform into such a lethal poison. The story of Elena, Maria, and Ricardo became a case study, a cautionary tale about the hidden wounds that lurk behind the closed doors of any home. The world, which had once held its breath, now exhaled a collective sigh, not of relief, but of deep reflection. The depth of the darkness the blue drum had revealed, and the terrible price of misunderstanding and silence, would echo for generations. The story of the savior tiger and the mother-in-law in the drum was not just about a crime, but about the fragility of human relationships, the need to listen, to see, to act before the poison of resentment corrodes everything, leaving behind only rubble and the shadow of a nightmare that, by a narrow margin, did not become an irreparable tragedy. And so, the silence, that same silence that had allowed the darkness to grow, now became a memorial, a constant reminder of what happens when voices are unheard and pains are ignored.